Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. My name is Lizzie Meister, and I'm thrilled to welcome you guys in person and online to this conversation between Jari and Marlene, remarkable charitable institutions of St. Charles Avenue. And then there's a date, 1860 to 1940. 40s. We'll keep going into the 40s. And we'll dive into this really important and interesting conversation about these charitable institutions. This is part of our Jewish Orphans Home of New Orleans special exhibition programming, most fortunate and unfortunate. It's on our third floor right now at the museum, and we invite folks who are in person to check it out, and online, come visit us before it closes January 30th. Before we get started into this program, I have a few little programming announcements, but the first programming announcement I want to highlight is our member bench match. I'm going to invite my colleague Cindy up to talk about the bench match, and I think you'll be okay standing right there, right? All right,
great. Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy. I'm the new membership manager here at the museum. Thanks, everyone, for coming out to this program, and I just want to say a big thanks to all of our members who are here in person and online, virtually. Great to see everyone. Our members are a big support to the museum. They enable us to have programs like this for free throughout the year. And right now we're having a big membership drive for anyone who becomes a recurring member of the museum. Your membership will be matched all the way through the end of the year. So if you have any questions about that, or you'd like to join as a recurring member and help us get that match, just please reach out to me via email or come see me after the program. Thanks so much. And thanks y'all.
And some of those upcoming programs that we have that are free to members and non-members because of donors is our next one is Sunday the 23rd here in New Orleans. It's an in-person tour of Hebrew Rest Cemeteries 1, 2, and 3. Starts at 10. We're going to enjoy a Sunday walk through a cemetery with Cliff Kern and Jacob Rosenzweig, cemetery executive director and cartographer. More details on our event website. And then 2 more exciting events happening at the museum before the end of the year. On December 4th, 3 Thursdays from now, Tim Alice will be here to talk about Henry Bendel, who was a department store owner up in New York. But he has some important Southern Jewish roots. Come to the museum to find out more about Henry Bendel. And then our free Hanukkah Family Day on Sunday, December 7th, we're doing a free family day. Admission to the museum will be free, and then we're going to have events for youngsters and the people who love them up in our classroom, craft, storytelling, dancing, music, and the most important thing, Hanukkah food. So join us on December 7th to get us ready to learn about Hanukkah and get us ready in the spirit of Hanukkah for Jewish and non-Jewish community members. Okay, lots going on, but let's dive into the story we're doing today. I want to introduce Marlene and Jari. Marlene Trestman is author of Most Fortunate Unfortunates, the Jewish Orphans Home of New Orleans, and guest curator of our current special exhibition of the same name. She is also the author of Fair Labor Lawyer, The Remarkable Life of New Deal attorney and Supreme Court advocate Betsy Margolin, who inspired Marlene to write about the orphanage in which Margolin was raised. In addition to prestigious research grants and accolades she has earned for her writing and for the exhibition, Marlene received a 2025 American Jewish Press Award for her article in B'nai B'rith magazine about American Jewish orphanages, and also served as a consultant about American Jewish orphanages to the production team of PBS's Finding Your Roots, for as a yet unidentified celebrity be featured in an upcoming season. I know we'll all be tuning in. And Jari C. Honora is a certified genealogist from New Orleans, a New Orleans native and proud Louisiana Creole with roots dating back more than 2 centuries along Bayou Lafourche and the German Acadian coast. He is a graduate of St. Augustine High School and Tulane University. He works as a family historian at the Williams Research Center of the Historic New Orleans Collection. He also does historic and genealogical research professionally, including previous work for TV program Finding Your Roots, We'll Meet Again, and the Georgetown's Memory Project. He's a trustee of the board for the certification of genealogists and a board member of the Louisiana Historical Society and Genealogical Research Society of New Orleans. I am so excited to get to listen to you speak about these three remarkable institutions. Take it away, Marlene.
Great. Thank you, Lizzie, and thanks to everyone who's here in person and online. And I'm so delighted to be here tonight to talk with Jari and Honora about the charitable institutions over my shoulder that once inhabited 3 full blocks on the riverside of St. Charles Avenue, from DeFawcett Street to today's Jefferson Avenue. Those familiar with New Orleans will know that the 3 blocks we're talking about are currently occupied by residences in the 5200 block of St. Charles, De La Salle High School in the 5300 block, and the Jewish Community Center where the home was. About 4 years ago, when I was still writing my book, Most Fortunate Unfortunates, Jari reached out to me. In a talk I was giving for this museum, Jari heard me say that I was searching for information about any relationships, if they existed, between the Jewish home and its children and its neighbors. Jari generously sent to me an article from 1954 from a magazine published by an international Catholic fraternal order for which he served, and perhaps still serves, as historian, in addition to all of the other things you heard about him. In that article, New Orleans Civil District Judge Louis Yarrett provided the following rare and improbably rosy account of the religious and racial atmosphere of that neighborhood during the years he grew up in the home, which were from 1896 to 1909. And as I'm about to read, he used the common parlance of his time. Quote, "On beautiful St. Charles and Jefferson Avenues, in one of the finest residential sections of New Orleans, each covering an entire square of ground, stood 3 institutions side by side. The Jewish Orphans Home was at the intersection of those avenues. Next to it was New Orleans University for Negroes, and next to that was the Protestant Orphan Boys Home. It was not unusual for us boys at the home to play ball one afternoon with our colored neighbors and the next with the Protestant boys. Never did I hear any vile epithet against race or religion. We were innocent children, unsullied with prejudice, having a good time. All 3 institutions are now gone. The Protestant home is now a high-class residential subdivision. The Negro College is now De La Salle Catholic Boys High School, and the Jewish Orphans Home is now the Jewish Community Center." So 4 years later, Jari and I are picking up that conversation again, and I'm delighted to have you listen in. I'm going to start with a little bit of background about what Judge Yarrett referred to as the Protestant Boys Home. The asylum was actually non-denominational, despite its common description as a Protestant home, and the fact that the superintendent, John Sutton, for the last 2 decades was a Methodist minister. The Society for the Relief of Destitute Orphan Boys was organized in 1824 to care for boys originally orphaned by yellow fever, and later admitted any destitute boy whenever the managers, quote, "found that humanity demanded it." Now, the Poydras Home for female orphans had already been established some 7 years earlier. Like New Orleans orphanages of the time, they were racially segregated and privately run. In 1860, with funds bequeathed largely by John McDonough, the Society hired prominent architect Henry Howard to build this large brick asylum on St. Charles Avenue, which was then known as Naiad Street. The boys, over the years, about 50 to 70 at any one time, generally were between 5 and 13 years old, and they attended the nearby public schools when they were old enough. The asylum housed a carpentry shop where the boys could learn skills and a swimming pool in the backyard. Around 1916, after the building suffered extensive hurricane damage and then a devastating fire, the asylum moved its boys to Pass Christian, Mississippi, until a new building could be erected. By 1920, William Burton, a wealthy lumberman, in memory of his deceased adult son, funded the purchase of a large tract on Carrollton Avenue, where the institution remains in operation to this day as the Waldo Burton Boys Home, making the institution now more than 200 years old. And I'm pleased that with us this evening is Dr. Alex Gagne, Waldo Burton's executive director. And for those here, he's in the front row. I can turn my page here. Now, turning to the Jewish Orphans Home, it was originally founded as the Association for the Relief of Jewish Widows and Orphans. It opened its doors to its first building on Jackson Avenue in Chippewa in 1856, making it the first purpose-built Jewish orphanage in the nation. The home moved to St. Charles Avenue in this building in 1887, designed by architect Thomas Sully, and praised at its opening as a magnificent monument to Hebrew benevolence. As you can see from this aerial photo from 1925, you can get a sense of the courtyard shape of the building. The home's maximum occupancy was 173, which occurred only briefly in 1915. The home admitted Jewish boys and girls who, in the beginning of the orphanage, were orphans and so-called half-orphans, meaning at least one parent was deceased, and later, by 1924, changed its constitution to admit any Jewish child whose parents were incapable of caring for them. The building boasted its own small synagogue, carpentry workshop, and a huge backyard where the children grew flowers and vegetables to eat and to sell. And if you can imagine, on St. Charles Avenue, they raised chickens, rabbits, goats, and even a cow. The children attended nearby public schools until 1904, when they attended the Isidore Newman School, which the Homes Board built and operated just 2 blocks away, where the children from the home learned side by side with children, then only white, of any religion whose parents could afford to pay the tuition. As the country moved toward foster care and away from institutional care for dependent children, the home's directors responded not by closing the orphanage's door. Instead, they strived to provide the most home-like care possible, and for which the home was rewarded with lavish praise. By the 1940s, Social Security and enhanced worker wages drove down the demand for the home, and its population dwindled while the costs of the overhead of the now cavernous and mostly empty structure skyrocketed. The home closed its doors as an orphanage in 1946 and transformed into today's Jewish Children's Regional Service to provide non-residential care and children's welfare services, ultimately moving its offices to Metairie. And I'm pleased that Mark Rubin, Executive Director of the JCRS, is also here with us tonight. The home in 1946 separately incorporated the Isidore Newman School, and it sold the orphanage building to the Jewish Community Center. The JCC operated out of the orphanage building for the next 2 decades, and along the way, as you can see from this little white marking in the newspaper photo, removed in 1953 the dilapidated 3rd floor and towers, and finally comports with my recollection of having been in that building and never having seen the ornamental towers or the higher structure. When the JCC tore down the old orphanage building and moved and built its current white modern structure in 1964, it preserved and re-embedded the home's 1886 cornerstone, which you can still see today just to the left of the entrance of the building. So I'm going to turn it over to now to Jari to talk about the other institutions in between the boys' home and the Jewish Orphans Home. And then we'll ask each other some questions and continue our conversation, like I said, and you all are welcome to listen in.
Thank you so much, Marlene. I have, unlike Marlene's 10 or 11 slides, I have 20, but I'll just have to talk quickly.
Take your time.
This image is the 1909 Sanborn map, which gives you a good idea of the position of the buildings of the Destitute Asylum for Boys, New Orleans University, and later Gilbert Academy, and the Jewish Orphans Home. Our story really begins here in the American South, where in post-Civil War, 4 million newly freed and formerly enslaved people found themselves with an insatiable hunger for education, something that had been denied them for centuries under enslavement. This map was done just on the eve of the Civil War in 1860, and it shows you the density of the enslaved population in various parts of the South. And you can see that one of the darkest shaded areas is along the Mississippi and Louisiana deltas, coming all the way down to the city of New Orleans. Into this world came what W.B. Du Bois called in 1904 in his magnum opus, The Souls of Black Folk, the crusade of the New England schoolmarm. And I just have to read to you what he said. Behind the mist of ruin and rapture waved the calico dresses of women who dared, and the hoarse mouthings of the field guns rang the rhythm of the alphabet. Rich and poor were these women, serious and curious, bereaved some of a father or of a brother or of more than these, and they came seeking a life's work in planting New England schoolhouses among the poor white and black of the South. They did their work well, and in the very first year they entered the Southland, taught more than 100,000 souls. These New England school moms, missionary lay people, lay men and lay women, were joined by the two other great factors in this movement. The freedmen themselves, like the Honorable Pierre Landry, who was born enslaved in the 1840s in Ascension Parish, upriver from New Orleans, became a Methodist minister, having initially wanted to be, desiring to be a Catholic priest, but that calling was denied him because of his race, and a politician, the first elected mayor of color in the United States, and an initial trustee of New Orleans University. And on the opposite side, Bishop J.P. Newman, who exemplifies the mostly northern-born Methodist clergymen who became the real zealots, if you will, the promoters of the cause of education, and often recruited northern businessmen, philanthropists, to give to this cause over the decades that followed. New Orleans University was preceded by some earlier educational institutions. The primary ones being the Thompson Biblical Institute for the Instruction of Ministers, and the Union Normal School, which offered a course for the instruction of teachers. That was the great need, as perceived by most of the Methodist missionaries who came into the South, was people to preach and people to teach. They shared a building on what is the upriver lakeside corner of Camp and Race Street. And you can see this is the corner here. So this is where we get the very birth of what becomes New Orleans University and what ultimately becomes Dillard University. It's important to note that New Orleans University, which was chartered in 1873, was just one of about a half dozen institutions of higher learning for Blacks right here in New Orleans, including Straight University, which started down on Esplanade, and for most of its history was on Canal Street, Canal at Russia-Blave. Leland University, which was also on St. Charles Avenue, further up where it meets Audubon Boulevard. The Peabody Normal Institute, Southern University, which was located on Magazine Street, the present site of Xavier Prep or Drexel Prep, until it moved to Baton Rouge after it closed in 1915, and the briefly operated Columbia University from 1887 to 1889. New Orleans University was, as I said, chartered in 1873, and it was fed into, it had feeder schools, preparatory schools throughout South Louisiana, places like Donaldsonville and Baton Rouge and Lake Charles, and over in St. Mary Parish near the town of Baldwin, Gilbert Academy. which was originally called the La Teche, for the Bayou Teche Seminary. It was an orphans asylum and a normal and industrial school. It was located at Baldwin, or the postal address was Winstead, Louisiana, until 1919, when it was merged into New Orleans University. The name Gilbert comes from this gentleman, William L. Gilbert, who was a New England clock manufacturer, who donated a total of about $50,000 or $60,000 towards this institution. He was from Winstead, Connecticut, if I'm not mistaken, and thus the postal address when it gained its own post office was Winstead, Louisiana. In 1886, having moved from the corner of Camp and Race, buildings that were inadequate for the growing student population, they acquired the tract in what was the Rickerville subdivision along St. Charles Avenue that you see here. Between 1886 and 1888, they constructed the main building, this iconic main building with its turret that was about 156 feet across. That gives you an idea of the dimensions. There was an L-shaped addition in back of this building that was added in 1898. In addition to the main building, there was a plantation home on the property ever since the 1830s, which initially was the instructional space on the campus before the main building was finished in 1888. Later, it became the president's home, and it was affectionately called by generations of students, the mansion. You could either report to the mansion for good reasons, or you could report to the mansion, for chastisement, but it was called the mansion. And there were some more contemporary buildings like the Peck Home, which served as an industrial boarding program for girls where they learned domestic science, as well as some adult women who were part of the Peck School. In 1891, when they were raising funds for the addition that was completed in 1898, this quote appeared in the annual journal of the Louisiana Methodist Conference, and I'll just read it. On St. Charles Avenue, in the finest residential portion of the city, stands the New Orleans University. On one side is the Jewish orphanage with property worth $100,000. In the adjoining block on the other side is the Protestant Episcopal Asylum for boys, another splendid property. In the center stands our own school, which last year had its greatest year of success. The three institutions present the sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth side by side, with the sons of Ham in the center, full of devotion and enthusiasm in acquiring an education. So I think that the juxtaposition of these structures, even in that period of the 1880s and 1890s, was notable. The funding for New Orleans University and Gilbert Academy came from, as I said, many Northern philanthropists. In the main building, there were over 80 different metal plaques all over the place, classrooms, offices, and what have you, from congregations throughout the country who sent funds to support the work of the school. A unique way that they raised their money was through the University Jubilee Singers. Just like Fisk University, founded by the AMA and the Congregational Church, New Orleans University had its own Jubilee Singers who would travel throughout the South and the North, performing for funds to help not only the university, but its feeder schools. In fact, on the postcard to your right, they were raising funds for Gilbert when it was still in Baldwin. The school expanded its mission beyond just teaching and the training of ministers for the Southland, including many people who became lifelong missionaries to Africa, both men and women. And throughout the university's existence, there was a group called the Friends of Africa, a student group with that interest. It also expanded in 1889 to have a medical college and a training hospital for nurses. The Flint Medical College was located in the 1500 block of Canal Street. You see it there. And this is one of the early graduating classes. And you see here Dr. Ella Prescott, who was only the second Black woman to earn a medical degree in Louisiana. If some of you may be familiar with the Hardin Park in the downtown section of the city, that's Dr. Joseph A. Hardin there. There also was an elementary school named for him prior to Katrina. The medical college closed in 1910 as a result of expansive study around the country funded by the can't remember the foundation, but it was foundation funded, and it led to the closure of almost all of the Black-run medical schools. They were all deemed unfit. The training hospital for nurses continued, and in 1932, it opened its building in the 2400 block of Louisiana Avenue, Flint Goodrich, which the building still stands. It's a residential facility for seniors. In 1919, the Louisiana Conference of the Methodist Church decided that Gilbert had served well in Baldwin, but it was necessary to merge it for financial reasons as well as to keep that steady stream of students to funnel into the university. And so it was brought to New Orleans, and the preparatory department, which had always existed at NOU, the high school department, was renamed Gilbert Academy. And it was the preparatory to NOU until NOU closed in 1935. The article on your left describes the deliberations about keeping Gilbert at the site even after the university merged into Dillard University. The longest serving principal of Gilbert was the lady at the center, a remarkable woman, Margaret Davis Bowen, who was an gifted artist, a real sculptress, promoter of African culture at a way ahead of her time, dressing in African garb on major occasions, even in the late 40s and 50s, well before the Black liberation movement and all of that. Gilbert continued for another 14 years after the university closed on that site as a high school conducted by the Board of Education of the Methodist Church. You can see some of the pleas that went out in the 1940s for funding, because by the time it closed, it was the only high school still maintained by the Board of Education of the Methodist Church. They had pulled out of secondary education, only the collegiate level. Also, there was less of a student population because New Orleans only had one public high school for Black students beginning in 1917, McDonough 35. By the 1940s, post-World War II, you start to see the opening of a Booker Washington and a Joseph S. Clark, and eventually a Walter L. Cohen High School and others like that. During its time, it hosted some influential people like Marian Anderson, who is seen here with her sorors of AKA, the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, in the president's home, in the mansion in 1940. And Miss Bowen is pictured right here. Gilbert put on a regular series of concerts, and I think that this program is really interesting because it is a review of, as the term went, Negro songs, Negro rhythms from the period of, as it's called here, primeval savagery. That can be interesting. Through the period of bondage, but then I think it's kind of redeemed here with describing the irrepressible spirit, the joy, the emotion, even going into the jazz age with pieces by Ellington and W.C. Handy and others. This concert was held in 1943 toward the close of Gilbert at the newly built Booker T. Washington Auditorium. I think the most important people in all of this, in addition to the clergymen, the missionaries who traveled to the Southland, and the Black Methodists themselves who helped to support the school, are the students. And we're fortunate that at the Historic New Orleans collection, we have this wonderful scrapbook from 1928, Miss Corinne Denson. And you see she describes here part of the clique on campus. You can see the main building in the background. This was a novelty, a girl out there as if she's playing football, and these boys doing what I think all college kids do, goof around. In its day, Gilbert Academy produced some remarkable alumni. Probably the best known is Ambassador Andrew Young, although you also have Olympic medalist Mickey Patterson, federal judge Bob Collins, and New Orleans author Tom Dent, whose father was the longest serving president of Dillard University. But my favorite alumni, the ones I know the most about, are these two ladies here. My great aunt, who was a member of the class of 1902, and this is her here in her class picture. And you can see the reflection of, I want to say, perhaps the Jewish Orphans Home in the window there because they're on the stairwell at NOU. And her niece, my great aunt, Laura Pierce Adams, who it was always said with a smile that Aunt Laura had gone to New Orleans University, because as you can see, I think she did more socializing than anything. In fact, it was told to me the only thing worthwhile she learned in her 2 years of college was how to play the piano. And I'll close with just this little snippet from the student newspaper that I love. And it says, Miss Laura Pierce has ousted Mr. Alonzo Sartor, her boyfriend, and is advertising for a brand new chic. This is the era of vamps, as the girls went by, the co-eds went by, and chics after Valentino, the Chic of Araby and all of that. She's advertising for a brand new chic who must be richly endowed with cash, as the new Fords are already out. P.S. Apply by Christmas. And so with that, I hope that I've given you just a sense of another remarkable institution along St. Charles Avenue. Thank you.
Oh, Jari, that was great. So I can't let you mention these distinguished alumni of Gilbert without mentioning a few from the home. And those who have seen the exhibit upstairs, and I invite you to read more on my website where I have profiles of some 300 alums of the home on different pages, but they include in politics, Louis Yarrett, who I mentioned before, who won election as a civil district judge, Sam Rosenthal, who became mayor of Rolling Fork, Mississippi, and served in that capacity for nearly 45 years. Bessie Margolin, the subject of my first book, who I am very pleased to say as a very important Supreme Court advocate and enforcer of the Fair Labor Standards Act, just received her belated obituary in the New York Times in a series called Overlooked Obituaries. So I feel my deed has been done with her. But we can also talk about some of the early people of the home who went on to great things, including Leah and Fannie Hutman, lived lives of community service. Fannie as president of El Paso's NCJW, National Council of Jewish Women, and she personally aided more than 200 European immigrants, and her files are in a university archives in Texas. And Sister Leah was praised as the mother of Hadassah in San Antonio and Houston. There were founders of synagogues like Ike Hockwald in Marshall, Texas, who was also called the father of baseball in that area for bringing a baseball league there. And Nathan Goldstein, a huge community activist and founder of a synagogue in Greenville, Mississippi. There were newspaper publishers throughout Texas. And there was also Morris Menzies, one of the earliest names to reach fame nationwide. He was in the home from 1856 to 1862, went on to become a drummer in the Confederate Army, but made his fame as a hotelier in Baltimore and New York, and one of the nation's earliest winners of a $1 million verdict when he brought a lawsuit against the nation's largest railroad tycoons. So he had his fame. But I also have to mention the infamous, and there were a few of those. The most noteworthy, and more information is on my website, was Norman Maier, who, born from his misguided passion for peace and nuclear disarmament, held the nation captive in December 1982 as he threatened to blow up the Washington Monument. So as someone has said praisingly about my book is warts and all, I want to make sure to tell you about some of our more colorful characters as well. So Jari, where should we start? I guess the thing that brought you to me in the first place was my search to understand, didn't the kids in the home have any kind of relationship with the kids from Gilbert? And that led me to your quote, and also to me having a chance to interview Ellis Marsalis, who I'll tell you his answer in a few moments, and a few snippets I gleaned from alumni. Can you give us a sense of what the atmosphere was like in New Orleans? So let's start with Gilbert, I guess, in terms of, 1935 to 40s.
Yeah, I think that the university, New Orleans University and Gilbert were havens for these students, where they could escape, in a sense, the harsh reality outside the walls of the institution, where they were faced by segregation on all fronts, including on a daily basis for many of them, just a streetcar ride to get up to the campus. Of course, having to sit in the back, oftentimes having drivers. Many of the students would comment on having drivers pass them up. And then they'd have to walk to campus. I'd like to think that Judge Yarrett's statement, especially in the early years prior to the 19 teens and 20s with the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan and everything, that there was some interaction between the students. But one thing I found that stood out for me is that in 1916, so a few years after the judge left the home, there was a fire at the Destitute Boys Home. While the dormitory areas were not damaged by fire, with all of the fallen debris and the water from the fire hoses and everything, their inmates, as they were called then, couldn't remain on campus. And so they were told to pack their things, and 51 boys were marched past New Orleans University to go and stay at the Jewish Orphans Home. And I think that from an adult perspective, instructing the boys, and the word was to march across the front of New Orleans University, it reinforced the divisions.
Mhm.
Maybe these were their baseball playmates, but they couldn't reside together. Not only was it against the law, it probably would have raised the ire of the adults who were involved in the situation.
Right.
And I think that kind of sums up the conditions on that front.
And what I found in my research, and it's in my book as well, is the minutes showing that the home invited the 30 to 50 boys from the Destitute Orphans Home to stay temporarily before they were relocated to Pass Christian. But the very same year, the only mention I could ever find of Gilbert, or before that NOU, or it was NOU at that time, was that the home, the Jewish Orphans Home, lodged a complaint against New Orleans University for the smoke and debris that was coming from the smokestack and getting into the dormitory building of the home. So again, as much as I love that Judge Yarrett's experience, and he was very young at the time, might have captured exactly what he saw, I could not find any other evidence of that. My conversation, which was really lovely at the time, that Ellis Marsalis, who was a graduate of Gilbert, and he was not there while the home was still there. He was there in 46 to 47, but he just he couldn't stress enough to me, you don't understand how, because I kept, there were musicians in the home, the Jewish home. I would think that, or the boys they want to see each other. There were kids the same age. And he just emphasized in no uncertain terms, you don't understand the pervasive segregation, how much that would have been against the law, the norms, if not the laws of the time for that to happen. He also told me when I pressed him again, in my search for, even evidence of bad relationship or anything happening, I told him that the home had some pretty prominent in later life musicians, including Joe, and of course it's Bahari, who went on to win was inducted in the National Rhythm and Blues Hall of Fame. And Mr. Marsalis said to me, Joe, I didn't know he lived in the home. We gigged together later in life, but I had no idea that he had lived in the home. So
just one other thing I'd like to
please.
mention is that in the published history of NOU and Gilbert, which was done in 35, the last semester before Dillard started holding classes, it mentions that promoters of the university and the students were invited into all of the houses of worship in the city and received some donations from those churches, including having been addressed on occasion by Rabbi Max Heller and a few other rabbis who were named. So in fact, the only ones that they were certain to point out that they were not invited to were the Catholics and the Lutherans. And if you know anything about interdenominational relations, that wasn't surprising, is that this home, which was distinctly Protestant, they didn't go into the Catholic churches and they didn't go to the Lutherans, who had their own institutions of learning, even in the Black community. So the fact that Rabbi Heller spoke to these students, it seems like took up a collection for them on at least one occasion, tells us that there was awareness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In a good way.
In a good way.
In a
of
good
them.
way. Well, we talked before about the programs that the Jewish orphans had that were mirrored in some ways, that both institutions were really trying to create social capital in their populations and inculcate them with values that would allow them to become productive citizens and represent the best values of their benefactors. In the home, for example, by the early 19-teens, there were student counselors who were brought into the home, who were students at Newcomb, Tulane, and the medical schools, who helped alleviate staff shortages by, in return for free room and board, serving as mentors and student counselors and helped with the homework, including some that really were very persuasive and became role models to the kids in the home. The other very important program is that Jewish women of the highest society in New Orleans served as big sisters to young women and boys in the home, and alumni had recorded, some telling their family, some leaving records to show. They learned about the finer things in life by being invited into the mansions on St. Charles Avenue, sometimes having a chauffeur pick them up from the orphanage, take them to a home where a butler would greet them, learning all the silverware, but also being treated to the theater and understanding the rules of society. So anything similar at NOU and Gilbert, Jari?
Yes, there was a loosely organized group of lay people who called themselves oftentimes the willing workers or university workers, and they would promote sometimes what they called University Day in their respective churches, not only in the city, but all throughout Louisiana, even into Mississippi, raising funds, arranging for the students to be brought by bus out to these rural areas to sing, to do elocution and what have you. And that was a big way of supporting the university. Because New Orleans University was so large and had its chapel space, as well as the President's Home, which was a beautiful building. You saw that even in 1940, it welcomed adult women. Those were all college graduates, members of the AKA sorority, onto campus. And so these students always had role models and exemplars in the person of the church workers, as well as the community members, particularly educators who frequented the campus.
One of the things I mentioned about my book is that I left no stone unturned to disclose warts and all. And there were obviously negative aspects of life in the home, not the least of which was strict regimentation, which even in the Destitute Orphan Boys Home was often lauded for its orderliness and cleanliness, and at the time was the way orphanages and asylums were run. But obviously the children might not have perceived those as always the best and warmest places. Also, too, many of these children by the late 19th century, late 1800s, were children of immigrants, and the home was seeking to turn them into productive Jewish Americans who could make their way in society. And what came of that, not unlike other Jewish orphanages across the country, was estrangement. As children going off to Newman School, sitting side by side and being friends with children of some of the wealthiest families in the city, often outpaced their surviving parents or relatives in terms of their ability to make a wage and to fit in. So estrangement was an issue as well. There were also, because in the orphanage sat in New Orleans at these very tempestuous times, the reclaiming of the lost cause, the whole racial segregation. The home was not immune to some of the now least favorable aspects, such as blackface minstrelsy, which was one of the most popular, unfortunately, popular entertainments across America at the time. There is clear record of the children, to the delight of onlookers, dressing in blackface minstrelsy to entertain the public, to raise funds and all of that. So Jari, anything that sort of caught you in your research about NOU and Gilbert, as long as we're telling tales?
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to mention is that John Wesley Bowen the third or fourth, there were a lot of them, leading Methodist family, including a bishop in that bunch. His mother, Margaret Davis Bowen, was principal, and he said that once his mother called him to her office and she was going to suspend her own son from school. And his retort was, "Well, Mom, if you do that, I'll just go to Xavier Prep with the Catholic kids." So it was a very strict place. But I think that as you saw in the performance schedule for the concert there, throughout its history, there was the encouragement of people to take up life's work as missionaries to Africa. And many of them became political figures and business, invested in businesses in particularly Liberia. And I think it was always portrayed as a place in need of help, in need of leadership, and a field for missionary work. I think that maybe only towards the end, as Ms. Bowen, began more of a
Pride.
interest in pride in Africa and everything, did they transition to seeing Africans as equals and as a real a source of pride and pride in their African origins. Before that, it was always the distraught, the dark continent, all of these descriptors used for Africa.
Yeah. Lizzie, how are we on time? We were going to leave time for questions from. Okay.
So if you're ready for questions, what I'll ask folks to do in person is to speak loudly, and if you could then repeat what they said or like the gist of it to the folks online.
Okay. Question in the front
I have
row.
a question. You were talking about mansions on St. Charles Avenue. And so for each of you, I guess as part of this question, I was hoping to learn more about Samuel Gould, who I think owned that house right there where the Gilbert Academy was before, they built the New Orleans University. So he apparently had some relationship with the early part of Gilbert Academy, I imagine. I know that young Gould went to public school here in an unusual way, and I was wondering anything more about that house where you said the president lived, but I think was that not the home of Samuel Gould?
Can you repeat it a little bit?
So I'm interested in that, and also with the Jewish Community Center, the history there with Maurice Stern, who I think lived in that beautiful mansion on St. Charles at Soniat, and was probably him deciding to live there that made the Jewish Orphans Home comfortable with building there, where their finance guy could be only a couple blocks away to look after it in the very early stages. So I was just wondering if you had any more information about either Samuel Gould, who I think owned that property before Gilbert Academy,
Or Maurice Stern.
University, or Maurice Stern's family.
You go first, Jerry.
Okay. I have to admit that I did
Can you
not.
repeat the question?
The gentleman asked about Samuel Gould, who was likely the owner of the 1830s mansion that was on the site that became New Orleans University and Gilbert Academy. And he also asked about Mr. Maurice Stern, whose home was on St. Charles Avenue, and any connections he might have had to the Jewish Orphans Home. I have not done a lot on the ownership of that tract of land prior to when NOU bought it, but from the 1830s when that home was built, there's a whole half century until you get to 1884, when the trustees of NOU bought the property. And Richard Campanella, though, who is a geographer and does a lot of architectural history, he wrote an article that covers the early history of the home. Yeah. And he describes it as an anomaly, the fact that it survived. Because it was not situated right up on the avenue. No. It was at a way back. Yeah, it's that way back. And it's just it was oddly positioned in the tract.
Yeah.
So I would refer you to Campanella's
Well,
article, yeah,
all cane fields until,
Yeah.
until they built the railroad through the middle of it.
that's right.
And the second part of the question was about Maurice Stern, who served as treasurer to the Jewish Orphans Home for many years. And his wife also had a very important job as a big sister and honorary matron to many of the children in the home. Yes, it is true that when the home was first located at Jackson and Chippewa, several of its board members were starting to build houses along St. Charles Avenue as other people were. And so it was becoming, even by 1880, a very desirable area. And yes, it was a place where they desired to go. It was also a place where they get a slightly bigger tract of land. And the importance of Maurice Stern for many reasons, one of which is their son, Edgar, married Rosenwald, whose first name I'm forgetting, the heiress.
Edith.
Thank you, Edith, the heiress to the Sears Roebuck fortune. But Hannah Bloom Stern and Maurice Stern were very big benefactors of the home and later moved to Rosa Park. But she still kept her affiliation as an honorary matron for years. So yes, you're
Yeah.
very astute in knowing all of that.
I
Thank
got
you.
The idea that they were comfortable with that kind of investment because he was just close by and they trusted him already.
As were others. And in my book, I don't recall right offhand, but by that time, Isidore Newman was soon to if he hadn't already, would soon build his home on St. Charles Avenue, as did other members of the board. Were moving from the Jackson, Chippewa, downtown canal areas out further uptown on St. Charles Avenue. Thank you. Other questions here, and then we'll find out what's online. Any questions that you can see from our, or the,
Nothing online yet.
okay, all right. What else can we talk about, Jari?
Well, I have no.
For what it's worth, I'm lucky enough to be on the board of the Boys Home, and Alex does an amazing job. But I'm actually a direct descendant of one of the founding board members in 1820, named Jean-Baptiste Labatut.
Labatut, wow.
And in the late 1900s,
Do I need to repeat that, Lizzie?
I feel like your voice is probably loud enough if you're close enough.
Or put this over.
well, in the late 19th century, the home boys, the Home for Destitute Orphan Boys grew most of their own food on site. And today we're moving in the same direction. We're about to set up gardens to grow food and have a pollination area and actually grow hydroponically inside as well. And gonna sell some of that food.
What goes around comes around. That's wonderful. And I also forgot to mention that we have another special guest in the audience, Jari.
I was just going to do that. So New Orleans University, the collegiate institution, in 1930, the leaders of New Orleans University and Strait, which was on Canal Street, they chartered a new school, Dillard University, named after Professor James H. Dillard. And in 35, they started their classes out on Gentilly Avenue. And just last week, Dillard installed its first native New Orleanian president. And on the staff of the president, we have Miss Ronette King, who is now editing the Dillard Today magazine, campus magazine.
Thank you for being here. Question?
It's so interesting that these institutions are all in such close geographic proximity to each other. Is there any evidence of the leadership having to sort of coordinate with each other about traffic or the sort of the most mundane challenges of running an institution like this?
I just moved that back over here. This is for just the room anyway. It's Sean, right? Hi, Sean. As I said, I scoured the minutes of the orphans home to find evidence of relationship, good, bad, and different. And the only one I found was that issue relating to the smokestack of New Orleans University spewing stuff that the Jewish home didn't like. You would think there were epidemics, there were all sorts of things that they could have communicated about. But what I did find was that John Sutton, the last superintendent of the Destitute Orphan Boys Home when it was on St. Charles Avenue, traveled in very much the same circles as the superintendent of the Jewish Orphans Home. They were both on the councils that oversaw charitable organizations. They would be at meetings, presumably together, even though reports were separate, overlooking the prison conditions. And prisons and children's institutions were sort of lumped in the same charitable category back then. Their paths had to have crossed, but nothing other than the smokestack issue could I find with the next door neighbor, from the Jewish Orphans Home. Thanks for the question.
This has intrigued me greatly to the point that we have our minutes and we're going to be looking. So hopefully there'll be a follow-up someday to that question, because if we documented it, we have it. So it's just a matter of researching and finding.
And I do, as you're talking, and that was Dr. Alex Gagne, the executive director of the Burton Boys Home, who was just talking. I did forget to mention that the white orphans of New Orleans were often treated. You have to understand, New Orleans is the birthplace of orphanages in the country. It boasts the first orphanage in the nation back to 1720 something, when the Ursuline nuns created the first, what was considered an orphanage. And because of the lack of government funding, privately run, mostly religiously affiliated orphanages predominated in New Orleans, perhaps like no other city. New Orleanians, the community was very charitable to the kids. My evidence was about the white kids, and they were treated often to steamboat rides collectively. It would talk about how the ship captain who owned a ship line would have the orphans from the Destitute Orphan Boys Home and the Jewish Home and others come and be on the ship together, even after it moved. They would also be treated to movies. The theater owners would have Orphans Day, and sometimes, bizarrely, there were no trigger issues, I guess, showing films like Daddy Longlegs, things that involved stories of orphans, which I found particularly interesting. So the kids, at least from the Orphan Boys Home and the Jewish home, certainly would have, if they didn't mingle, were in the same picnics and steamboat rides and theaters together. So on that level, there was coordination, even if it didn't come about because of coordination by the superintendents. Lizzie?
Time for, I get to ask the last question, unless, we have other ones. My question is about the geography. It's so interesting to me to have a group of so many young people in one spot on St. Charles Avenue. What if you've spoken about some of the big mansions that are around there that are homes? Is there any other notable things within that span, or repetitious clumps of things like theater? This is like young person alley, if you will. Is there anything else that's notable along that stretch of land at this time? Or is it just a happenstance to put these youngsters all together?
I think it was the happenstance of, you have to remember back in the 1860s, certainly when the Destitute Orphan Boys came along, Ottoman Park didn't exist. It had just or would soon be the site of the World's Exhibition. And so it was sort of open land still waiting to happen. There were tracts of land that by that time the streetcars, courtesy, I think in part due to Isidore Newman's business wizardry, the streetcars were becoming electrified by the end of the 19th century. So there was more movement there, but there were available tracts of land, which I think
the best example of that in terms of other neighboring institutions would probably be Tulane University,
Exactly.
which leaves what is now the CBD in a series of buildings where it was in the business district, and moves up to St. Charles Avenue in the 1880s. And then its neighbor comes along in the first decade of the 20th century, Loyola University, which had also been in the CBD as well. So, I think it is still rare to have major colleges on these relatively long, narrow tracks immediately adjacent to each other. Another example would be Academy of the Sacred Heart, which still has its imposing campus along the avenue. And I think there's a reason why you have so many large houses of worship, both Jewish with Temple Sinai and Turo, but also, Catholic and Protestant as well along the avenue, because you had these undeveloped tracts of land.
Yeah, and it was no accident that Isidore Newman School was open just 2 blocks from the home. It was decreed that they did not want the children being isolated, the Jewish children in the home, by having a school, as was originally thought, within the premises, and instead wanted them to be in the community and indeed learning side by side with children of the wealthiest white Jewish and non-Jewish families. And of course, public schools, Riverside, were where the Jewish orphans went to school before the Isidore Newman School opened, and where the kids, so there were schools that were sporadic. But the other thing I want to note is that the size of these streets, Valmont and particularly Leontine, they are tiny. And so the other memories that I got from alumni is that the boys in the Jewish Orphans Home who lived along the Leontine Street side of the building, as you remember from the corridor, those were the dormitories. The girls were along Jefferson Avenue. Boys in the dormitory of the Jewish Orphans Home during the 30s and 40s would talk about watching football practice, the kids in Gilbert next door. And so they would see them, I can't, spitting distance is a not polite way.
Before the New Orleans University was built. So they could see
No.
across to, oh, no,
No.
Yeah,
Gilbert was in the premises, was on the same premises of
Right.
New Orleans University.
But
And
Gilbert was there before the brick building designed by Gallier, right? There was that open field, and I don't know when.
no, New Orleans University was built right after they broke ground right after the Jewish Orphans Home was built. So those two were side by side from essentially 1888 to the 1946 when the home closed. So the boys who would talk about Gilbert it was post 1935
That's right.
when Gilbert was brought from Baldwin to the New Orleans University campus. So this is the 30s and the 40s
Louisiana is where?
in Louisiana.
It's in St. Mary Parish, near, close to Morgan City.
That gets back to my other question, was that this New Orleans University left in 1935 to get together with Dillard and Strait and all the other, but so Gilbert continued until 1949?
It continued
They didn't
alone.
tear this building down?
No,
Oh, no,
no, it wasn't torn
Until
down
De La Salle?
until
until
De
De
La
La Salle
Salle
bought
came
it.
along.
That's right. That's right. Even though they were constantly approached, that's one of the things that the trustees commented on by real estate developers. People want to sell, sell, sell. And finally, once the Board of Education or the church pulled a good bit of its funding, they did sell.
Well, I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Jari. This was
So
very
much.
fun. Lizzie, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. I have so many questions that I think have to go unanswered. Like, surely these students interacted somehow. Surely the workers at the home interacted with the students at New Orleans University, but these stories don't always get saved. And so I'm always fascinated by these conversations and our ability to look back at the past, see what archival information we have, and try to piece together more stories. So thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. Recording today's presentation will be available online. Thanks everybody who's here.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
All right. Thank you.